On December the 11th of 2021, Connecticut woman Lauren Smithfields invited 37-year-old software designer Matthew LaFountain to her Bridgeport home. They had reportedly met on the Bumble dating app. At the time, 23-year-old Smithfields, a former high school track star, was studying to become a physical therapist at Norwalk Community College. By all accounts, she was in good health. At around 6 a.m. on the morning following their date, LaFountain called 911 to report that the young woman was unresponsive. He performed chest compressions on her as instructed by the operator, but Smithfields died at the scene. She was found with a bloody nose, and there was also blood on the bed sheets. Further evidence indicated that Smithfields and LaFountain had had intimate relations. As reported by first responders, the latter was in a state of shock and seemed shaken up. An autopsy report indicated that Smithfields had succumbed to an accidental overdose from a combination of fentanyl, promethazine, hydroxyzine, and alcohol. She had no known history of drug abuse, so the cocktail of drugs in her system wasn't regarded as being in line with her behavior. LaFountain would admit that he and his date had drunk tequila, but was cleared of any involvement in her death upon questioning. In the incident's wake, the police would be heavily criticized by Smithfield's family for their handling of the case. After identifying her, they didn't immediately notify her next of kin, who reportedly learned of the woman's passing from her landlord. The police was also accused of not doing their due diligence in investigating LaFountain, whom Smithfields' family suspected of drugging her. They allegedly were told by Bridgeport police that there was no need to investigate him. Some regarded the case as an example of institutionalized racism, pointing out that it would have received a greater degree of attention had the dead woman been white. On January the 25th of 2022, after weeks of pressure from activists, Smithfield's family and a tweet from rapper Cardi B raising awareness to the case, a criminal investigation was opened. Yet, as of the latest updates, no criminal charges had been brought to LaFountain. Number 7. Benjamin Obadiah Foster. 36-year-old Benjamin Obadiah Foster kidnapped and brutally assaulted a woman in Grants Pass, Oregon on January the 24th of 2023. The victim, identified as 37-year-old Justine Siemens, had previously been in a relationship with Foster. She was found bound, unconscious, and near death after being intentionally tortured for an extended period of time. She was hospitalized in critical condition with a broken neck and multiple facial fractures, but was eventually stabilized. A manhunt was launched for Foster, who'd exhibited similar violence against women in the past, in 2019. Prior to moving to Oregon, he'd held his then-girlfriend captive inside her Las Vegas apartment for 2 weeks. The woman suffered 7 broken ribs and 2 black eyes, had been choked to the point of unconsciousness, and was force-fed lye before she was able to escape. Foster faced decades in prison after being charged with 5 felonies, but he ultimately took a deal and pleaded guilty to 1 felony count of battery and a misdemeanor count of battery constituting domestic violence. It meant that with credit for time served while awaiting trial, Foster was overall jailed for less than 3 years. In the aftermath of the January 2023 kidnapping, while he was on the run, Foster was active on dating apps as he sought help from unsuspecting individuals to evade the law. A SWAT team raided a property in Wolf Creek about 20 miles north of Grants Pass. They arrested 68-year-old Tina Marie Jones at the scene and charged her with hindering prosecution. She'd followed Foster in a vehicle to a remote Wolf Creek location, where she then intentionally drove his 2008 Nissan Sentra over an embankment before giving him a ride to the property that was raided. Jones was believed to have been recruited online. Foster still eluded capture, but was eventually tracked down after he'd taken a taxi back to the Grants Pass property where he'd tortured Siemens. He hid underneath the home, and after an hours-long standoff with law enforcement, was found dead from a gunshot wound. In the aftermath, investigators determined that Foster was the sole suspect in a double homicide that had occurred on January the 27th. The victims were identified as Richard Lee Barron Jr. and Donald Owen Griffith, both of whom had succumbed to blunt force trauma, but no further details regarding their deaths were made available to the media. Number 6. Blanca Ariana. In 2022, Mexican woman Blanca Ariana met Peruvian man Juan Pablo Jesus Villafuerte through an online gaming app. After talking for a few months, she decided to fly 3,000 miles to Lima to meet him in person in late October. When she last spoke to her niece on November the 7th, the 51-year-old reported that the relationship with Villafuerte was going great and that she was in love with him. The niece was no longer able to get in contact with Ariano in the aftermath. She spoke to 37-year-old Villa Fuerte, who claimed that the woman had gotten bored with him and had decided to return to Mexico. On November the 9th, however, the faceless head of a woman was found on a beach close to where Ariana had been staying. Within hours, a finger with a missing tip and a silver ring on it also turned up. The following day, a torso void of organs was discovered at the end of a canal that flowed into the sea. The authorities determined that the body parts had been removed with surgical precision. The canal where the latest remains had been discovered traveled in front of Jose Faustino Sanchez Carrion National University, where Villa Fuerte was a student of medicine and biotechnology. Local law enforcement found traces of Ariano's blood in multiple areas of Villa Fuerte's apartment. In the days since her disappearance, he'd also reportedly posted clips of her organs on TikTok with the intention of selling them. He fully denied involvement in her death but was arrested for murder, human trafficking, and organ trafficking. Number 5. Kevin Bacon. 25-year-old Michigan man Kevin Bacon started talking to a man on the Grindr dating app on Christmas Eve 2019. His prospective date used an alias, but his real name was Mark Lutunsky, a man twice Bacon's age. After he didn't show up to a family Christmas Day gathering, Bacon was reported missing, and the police went to search Lutunsky's house in Morris on December the 28th. In a secret room in the basement, they found Bacon's dead body hanging upside down from the rafters. It would later emerge that Lutunsky had slit his throat and even eaten pieces of his body, which investigators determined was part of him enacting a violent fantasy. In November of that same year, one of Lutunsky's neighbors was met by a blood-covered man desperately knocking on his front door. He was reportedly wearing a leather skirt and had belts across his chest. The man was screaming, "Help me, keep him away, and he wants to hurt me." The police were called, but the victim was so terrified of Lutunsky that he didn't press charges. On September the 22nd of 2022, weeks before he was due to go to trial, Lutunsky pleaded guilty to Bacon's murder and to mutilation of a dead body. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Number 4. Rachel Juarez and Ron Jai Cook. On February the 7th of 2023, an unnamed 23-year-old man went to the home of Rachel Juarez at the La Esencia Apartments in Houston, Texas. They'd met through a dating app before Juarez asked the man to come over. Upon entering the home, he was threatened with a knife and held at gunpoint by his date and her boyfriend, Ron Jai Cook, who demanded his belongings. After the man did as the couple asked, Cook escorted him outside. In the moments that followed, the man ran to his car, pulled out a firearm and fatally shot Cook. It would emerge that the latter had been threatening him with a replica handgun wrapped in duct tape. Juarez was jailed on a $50,000 bond after she was arrested and charged with aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. The case of the fatal shooting was passed to a grand jury to decide if charges were warranted. Number 3. Ingrid Lynn. 40-year-old Ingrid Lynn, a nurse at the Swedish Medical Center in Seattle, started talking to John Carlton on a dating website in the spring of 2016. He was at the time a day laborer of no fixed address who had a record in 6 states for crimes that included assault, felony theft, and aggravated robbery. On April the 8th of 2016, he and Lynn met for a date and went to a Seattle Mariners baseball game. The following day, Lynn's ex-husband went to her Renton home to drop off their children and found that she wasn't answering the door. Lynn's mother arrived with a key and noticed that her daughter had disappeared while her wallet, cell phone, and purse were still inside the home. The police were called, and officers who searched the home found blood and pieces of flesh, as well as trash bags and a 15-inch pruning saw in the bathroom. That same day, April the 9th, a homeowner had called the police to report finding multiple severed body parts, including a head, foot, arm, and leg in a Seattle recycle bin that was about 10 miles from Lynn's home. The remains were confirmed as the woman's, and the trash bags in which they'd been placed were identical to those found in her bathroom. Carlton was arrested within days. He told the police that he'd gotten blackout drunk during the date and had woken up on a Seattle sidewalk with no recollection of what had happened between him and Lynn. He pleaded guilty to the woman's murder and dismemberment on October the 2nd of 2017 and was sentenced to 27 years and 9 months in prison. Number 2. Willie Lee Smith. On June the 16th of 2021, Willie Lee Smith met 24-year-old Cheyenne Brooks Brown through a dating app and then went to her home in Flores, Indiana. Upon arrival, as Smith was talking to Brooks Brown, he was ambushed by her boyfriend, 22-year-old Tyrone Lethbridge. It would later emerge that Lethbridge had used his girlfriend's profile to offer her up for intercourse in exchange for cash. Brooks Brown was talking to Smith to let him know that she hadn't agreed to the arrangement. In the moments that followed, Lethbridge charged Smith and struck him twice in the head with a baseball bat before robbing him of his cash, wallet, and cell phone. 55-year-old Smith, who suffered from severe kidney problems and was in stage 5 renal failure, was flown to IU Health Methodist Hospital where he succumbed to his injuries on June the 18th. Lethbridge pleaded guilty to murder in October 2022 and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. We have our previous release on When Dating Bad Boys Goes Wrong lined up for you right after this, in case you feel like watching some more They Will Kill You today. Number 1. Adam Hillier. After breaking up with his long-term girlfriend, with whom he shared a 5-year-old daughter, Florida man Adam Hillier created a profile on the Plenty of Fish dating website. He eventually connected with 18-year-old Haley Rose Bustos. In August of 2016, they met for a date in Winter Haven and then spent some time talking at Hillier's Auburndale apartment before he dropped her off. The events that followed would reveal that Bustos had been planning to rob him the entire time. At around 3 a.m. on August the 17th, she rode with 3 companions, whom she directed to Hillier's home after telling them about what they could steal from it. The men were identified as Andre Warner and Joshua Ellington, both aged 29, and 34-year-old Gary Gray. The latter and Warner forced their way inside the apartment. Warner ordered Hillier to get on his knees and shot him in the back of the head execution style during the robbery. He was reported to have later laughed at how Hillier was begging for his life and telling the men to take what they wanted but to spare his life for the sake of his young daughter. Bustos, Warner and their accomplices were arrested in the aftermath, all facing charges of first-degree murder, robbery with a firearm, conspiracy to commit armed robbery and burglary with a weapon. Bustos took the stand and testified against Warner during his trial, telling the court, "I really don't care if I spend the rest of my life in prison as long as he's behind bars too." On March the 20th of 2020, Warner was convicted on all charges and the jury recommended he be given the death sentence. However, because of delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, his original jury was subsequently dismissed and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole in a follow-up hearing. Number 8. Joshua Cavet. In the fall of 2013, Oregon woman Jessie Cavet was looking to divorce her 36-year-old biker husband Joshua. Jessie, aged 27, had also filed a restraining order against a man who, in the past, had threatened to peel her skin off layer by layer and give her a fatal drug injection. Joshua's highly aggressive and paranoid behavior was attributed to drug use but also to a brain injury he'd sustained from a beating meant as an induction to a biker gang. He belonged to the notorious Gypsy Jokers, an outlaw motorcycle club whose membership was exclusively white. Some of Joshua's face and neck tattoos were indicative of his allegiance. On October the 12th, he and Jessie were arguing at the latter's Gresham apartment about visitation rights for their young daughter Peyton. As tensions escalated, he shot the mother of 4 in the head. Peyton and another of Jessie's children were home at the time of the shooting. In the aftermath, Joshua fled with his daughter and left the other child behind with her dying mother. She called a friend, who in turn alerted the authorities. Roughly 10 hours after the incident, the biker was recognized from an Amber Alert and arrested near his apartment. His daughter was unharmed in the incident. At Joshua's home and in his backpack, law enforcement found several firearms as well as a bulletproof vest. Under a plea bargain, he admitted murder as well as felon in possession of a firearm and felon in possession of body armor. He was sentenced to life in prison with parole available after 28 years. Number 7. Herbert Nixon Flores. Harrowing home surveillance footage from the Pacoima section of Los Angeles showed a gang member gunning down his estranged girlfriend at point-blank range on January the 6th of 2021. 31-year-old Karen Ruiz was in the process of dropping her daughter off when another car pulled up behind her SUV. Ruiz started screaming, ran towards a doorway and began banging on the door. A man emerged from the second vehicle and chased her with a pistol in hand. He was identified as 46-year-old Herbert Nixon Flores, Ruiz's estranged partner and the father of her child. He shot her 6 times at point-blank range and then fled. The FBI Fugitive Task Force, who was called to assist in his apprehension, described Flores as a member of MS-13, often referred to as the most dangerous and ruthless gang in the world. Investigators learned that after the killing, Flores planned to visit family northwest of Dallas, Texas. The city's air units and ground patrol tracked him down on a roadway in the Irving area. Realizing he was being tailed, the man abandoned his vehicle and continued on foot. Then, as law enforcement was closing in, Flores fatally shot himself. Number 6. Ricardo Barbaro. At some point between April the 28th and May the 4th of 2020, Australian woman Ellie Price was knifed to death at her South Melbourne townhouse. Once 26-year-old Price's body was discovered with fatal injuries to the back and neck, a manhunt was launched for her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Ricardo Barbaro. He was the last person seen leaving Price's home on April the 29th and had recently been released from jail for assaulting her. He'd reportedly smashed the single mother's head into the dashboard of his car, splitting open her eyebrow. As reported by Price's mother, Barbaro had also choked and threatened to kill her in the past. Within less than a week of the body's discovery, he was apprehended in Sydney and extradited to Victoria. Barbaro allegedly had ties to the Calabrian mafia, and Price, who'd previously worked as an exotic dancer, was believed to have been caught up in his criminal activity. She was in the process of extorting her friend and reported father figure, Mark Gray. At the time of her death, Price threatened to falsely accuse the 54-year-old of abusing her if he didn't give her $100,000. The man agreed to transfer the first of 4 $25,000 payments, but evidence suggested that the money was actually meant for Barbaro. The latter denied the murder charge, and his trial was ongoing as of the latest updates. Number 5. David Obregon Castro. A love triangle ended in bloodshed on May the 23rd of 2018, when a woman was stabbed to death on the balcony of her apartment in Toronto, Canada. That month, Sarah Lopez Iglesias discovered that her drug dealer boyfriend, David Obregon Castro, had cheated on her. The scorned woman confronted love rival Abigail Elliott, aged 21, behind the latter's apartment at 70 Spadina Avenue. During the fight, Elliott bit Iglesias in the face while one of her male friends struck her in the head with a pipe. Obregon Castro was enraged that Lopez Iglesias had been hurt in the confrontation, even though he was also reported to have been abusive towards her in their relationship. The couple, both in their late 20s at the time, burst into Elliott's apartment on May the 23rd. Obregon Castro quickly let off 2 shots from his revolver, aiming at Elliott and one of her 2 male companions present in the home at the time. Elliott was then stabbed multiple times on the balcony, eventually succumbing to her injuries. The couple was arrested a few days after the woman's death, but neither initially took responsibility for the fatal stabbing. In a letter that Lopez Iglesias had written her boyfriend after the incident, she professed her love for him and claimed they were Bonnie and Clyde. The jury eventually accepted that Lopez Iglesias was a battered woman consumed by jealousy and a toxic relationship who'd been pressured into going to the apartment by her boyfriend. Leading up to Elliott's murder, the man had reportedly spiraled out of control as he'd slashed a childhood friend across the face with a knife and shot a rival dealer twice in the legs. The jury acquitted Lopez Iglesias and found Obregon Castro guilty of second-degree murder. Number 4. Catelyn Mitchell. In April of 2022, armed law enforcement in Canterbury, England, were dispatched to the Goth Ink tattoo studio on Lower Bridge Street. Inside, they found the dead bodies of 54-year-old tattoo artist Catelyn Mitchell and his wife, Ramona Stoyer, aged 35. Prior to the discovery, Stoyer had gone to the police and accused Mitchell of having repeatedly forced himself on her. In recent years, she took out a non-molestation order against her husband, which had reportedly breached in March of 22 when he abused her once again. Mitchell was arrested and released on bail on April the 20th, 9 days before he was found dead alongside his wife. The conditions of his release had allowed him to work with her at the tattoo studio they shared. On April the 29th, he was believed to have attacked Stoyer without provocation, inflicting a fatal stab to her neck. He then turned the knife on himself and ended his life. Number 3. Fatherine Deonta Greer. In the summer of 2022, a young man connected to rapper Young Thug was arrested in Georgia for gunning down his girlfriend. Young Thug, Jeffrey Lamar Williams by his real name, had recently been arrested as part of an extensive racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's investigation. The prominent rapper was identified as the head and co-founder of a violent street gang called Young Slime Life. According to an 88-page indictment, the gang had been responsible for multiple murders, shootings, and car thefts, spanning over a decade. It wasn't clear if Fatherine Deonta Greer, Young Thug's nephew, was connected to the operation, but that aspect was largely eclipsed by the killing of his girlfriend. In July of 2022, officers responded to reports of a shooting on the 4000 block of Fox Hunt Lane in East Point. They came upon the lifeless body of 24-year-old Destiny Fitzpatrick, lying in a pool of blood by the front door. Greer, who was found crying at the residence, initially told them he'd fought off a pair of armed intruders. He was arrested and charged with murder after eventually admitting that he'd shot Fitzpatrick in the face. Neighbors told law enforcement that they'd heard the couple arguing in the home prior to the sound of gunfire. Today's topic was requested by Irvington81. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Simon Brittle. For 4 months leading up to early May of 2013, British woman Heidi Smith from Nottingham, England, had been dating fellow motorcycle enthusiast Simon Brittle. Their relationship was turbulent, ostensibly due to the man's violent behavior, and 44-year-old Smith had become too terrified of him to end it. 2 days before an upcoming motorcycle rally, he threatened her on Facebook. Brittle told her to take plenty of bodyguards and that he was looking forward to beating her up, cautioning that she had no idea what he was capable of. During the event held on May the 4th in South Dalton, East Yorkshire, an intoxicated Brittle became loud and aggressive, accusing Smith of having slept with another man. He then viciously attacked her with punches. Brittle forcefully twisted the woman's arm before taking her to the ground and straddling her. In the context of a crowd and loud music, many of the bystanders thought the couple was in a loving embrace. One of Smith's friends realized that she was being attacked and tried to intervene. It was then that Brittle lowered his head like he was going to kiss Smith and proceeded to sink his teeth into her nose. The woman let out a chilling scream before she fell backwards and clutched her bloodied face. She was left with a gaping hole where her nose used to be. Smith was rushed to the hospital where surgeons used skin from her hip to mend the injury, but the end result was what the woman described as a pointy witch appearance. She subsequently moved from the home she'd lived for more than a decade because Brittle knew her address. The man subsequently pleaded guilty to wounding with intent and was jailed for 8 years. Number 1. Joshua Valam. Joshua Valam, a member of the Latin Kings gang, was sentenced to 49 years in prison in May of 2017 in the aftermath of the first ever transgender hate prosecution in the US. Valam told the authorities that he'd been dating teenager Mercedes Williamson for a few months. She'd been born male but transitioned to female, an aspect of which Valam initially claimed to have been unaware. On May the 30th of 2015, they reportedly became intimate at the home of his father in Lucedale, Mississippi. 28-year-old Valam, according to his initial testimony, discovered that she was transgender and killed her in a panic. He shot Williamson with a stun gun, stabbed her multiple times in the head, and then beat her to death with a claw hammer. Valam was arrested and in the early stages of the legal proceedings associated with his case, told the court, "I killed Mercedes and she's in hell now," citing that he felt secure in his relationship to God. His panicked defense soon started to falter. Williamson's best friend, whom had lived with the slain teen, reported that she and Valam had slept together numerous times and even expressed their love for each other. The FBI found many explicit photos and videos of men on his phone, contradicting his supposed bias. The gang member ultimately admitted the truth, pleading guilty to murder with a hate crime stipulation. He admitted that he'd known Williamson was transgender, an aspect that he'd kept secret from all others in his life, and that they'd had an ongoing and consensual intimate relationship. Valam planned to kill her out of fear after a friend found out about her gender identity. The man was worried that his fellow Latin kings would also learn about their romance, which the gang forbade and violently punished them. He located Williamson at her Alabama residence, lured her to Mississippi under a false pretense, and then brutally murdered her. Thanks for watching. Would you rather only meet your dates online or in real life? Let us know in the comments section below.